Hello everyone, and welcome to the Global Mangrove Alliance webinar on guidelines for using satellite imagery in mangrove monitoring. I'm Dr. Chris Brown from the Global Wetlands Project and co-lead of the Global Mangrove Alliance Science Working Group. Now, it's traditional in Australia to pay respects to the Indigenous people of the lands on which we work. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Muwinina people and acknowledge that across the world where many of us are working, that we're working on the lands of Indigenous people whose land has been misappropriated through colonisation. So thank you for joining our webinar today. We have three speakers, Dr. Pete Bunting, who's a reader in remote sensing at Aberystwyth University, Dr. Lola Fatoyinbo, who's research scientist at the Biospheric Lab, NASA, and Dr. Schill, lead scientist at the Nature Conservancy Caribbean Division. So each of our presenters is going to do a 5-minute presentation on their topic. And then we'll have about 30 minutes for a question and answer session. So please feel free to use the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom there if you have any questions. And I've also had a few questions emailed in. So I'll get started. I'll hand over to Pete to the first presentation. Thank you, Pete.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get the screen shared. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. So I thought I'd focus a little bit more about kind of how do global products kind of fit and how do they fit for different use cases. So just to highlight what it is that I focus on. So I do a lot of the data analysis behind the kind of global mangrove extent and change products that sit inside the Global Mangrove Watch portal. And we also do this product of monthly alerts of losses. So my talk's going to mainly kind of focus around kind of those two products. Obviously, there's all the other products that other people kind of mainly contribute to, which are part of the Global Mangrove Watch platform as well. So if we think about the kind of global extent product, what we're trying to get there is a product that is methodologically the same kind of wherever you go. So it's trying to be an equivalent data set. So wherever you go in the world, that you get similar data sets. And that means that you should allow comparison between regions. So if you're interested in comparing changes in one area, so one country and against another country, or in kind of larger regions, then this data set can can be used for that. It's not weighed down by, say, different methodologies being used for different products that are being compared. It also means that there's data everywhere. So kind of if there is countries or regions that don't have data sets, then this obviously then provides a data set that is the same everywhere. One of the things that we've been trying to do through this product, so I guess one of the things that I guess drives me through this work is that people actually use the data set and that there's kind of a wider interest in it. And part of that is also we know that because we receive feedback in the data set, so where things haven't worked as well as they might, so where we've misclassified what mangroves are. And that has resulted in this kind of iterative process of improvement. So the current versions that are on the portal are version 3, and we're currently working up to the release of the version 4 data sets that I'll show you an example of later. I guess, and that leads on to then this question of kind of local versus global. So I guess I would be of the opinion that kind of a local product with the same amount of effort that's been put into that local product will always be kind of better than kind of something which is a global product, because you get kind of local optimizations in your algorithms or your approaches, but also you've got a lot of local knowledge that's embedded kind of within those products that is much easier to do at a kind of a local level. So I think that kind of combination of kind of how global fits with local, kind of if you have a lot of local knowledge, you can really make some gains in that area as well. So looking at the kind of mangrove loss alert products we do, so obviously we want to kind of understand kind of where losses are occurring in a timely manner. So losses can occur quite quickly if you have a large erosion event or if people are cutting. And the real kind of, I guess, the heart behind this product is to try to improve the kind of local relevancy of some of the data sets we have on the Global Mangrove Watch portal. So this processing is run on a monthly basis. And At the moment, we cover about half the world's mangrove area, but only about a third of the 1 by 1 degree tiles that have mangroves within them. So in this lower image here, you can see all the kind of darker blue out boxes. This is where we currently cover with the alerts that you can find on the Global Mangrove Watch portal. And on the left-hand side here, I've seen an example. I've got an example that, if you've heard me talk about this before, you may well have seen this example, where this example from Guinea-Bissau, where a dam was built, which is this image in the bottom left-hand corner there. And that dam basically stopped the tidal range coming into this area, which then over the kind of preceding few years has then resulted in dieback of mangroves, which you can see in the sequence of satellite imagery above, and then the alerts that are associated with it. In this particular case, this is about kind of this dam was about food production, so it's about converting this area for rice cultivation. So as a question for you guys, you can have a think about is in which country are mangroves currently most at risk? So just in your own mind, which out of the countries, where would you think is where most mangroves are being lost at the moment? So from the alerts, we found that basically this is Myanmar. So one of the advantages of having these global products is the fact that we can look at kind of more coherently across the world. So in this case, with the alerts, we have about 500,000 alerts kind of within the system at the moment, of which getting on for nearly 200,000 alerts are within Myanmar. So at the moment, that corresponds to roughly around 7,500 hectares of mangroves being lost. And I've got some examples here. So this kind of sequence of images kind of going down the middle there. This is showing a planet image from 2019, and then another one for 2024. And then you can see the alerts kind of in the bottom image there. And so this is an area where we're seeing a lot of alerts occurring. It's an area that's seeing a lot of mangroves being lost. And I don't think we would probably know this without the alerts as we go. Just to give you a hint of what's coming. So as I said before, we're currently working on version 4 of the Global Mangrove Watch products. So specifically, this is a 10-meter global baseline. This is a comparison between version 3 and version 4. So there's a whole bunch of improvements there. We've had loads of different bits of user feedback that have contributed to this. So some of it is areas that we've missed. In this example, in the inland area, you can see there was an area that we hadn't mapped due to the habitat mask being cut inappropriately, but also kind of we're improving the spatial resolution to 10 meters, which allows us to capture a lot more defined detail as well. And we're currently revising all the change layers that are associated with that as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions on that as well. So I will hand on to Lola, I think.
It's a pleasure to be here today, and I figured I would talk a little bit about some of the data products that we have been working on at NASA Goddard that are focused on mangroves. It's great also to be going after peat, because I think having the background of the extent data that is really the baseline to a lot of the products that we use is really important. So the first product that I'll be talking about that I wanted to share and highlight here is a global map of mangrove biomass and carbon stocks that we have been working on. We now have 2 timescales of this map. First one that was published in 2019. This was based on 2000 data, highlighting essentially where mangroves, the distribution of canopy height of mangroves. And so this is based on different satellite data sets. It's using radar technology and LiDAR technology together, which is one of the kind of the critical aspects or the specialties of my team and that we've been working on. But this is really useful because it allows us to kind of take it to the 3rd dimension and to get data that and information about mangroves that can be used in several ways. So one of the more obvious applications is that we were able to produce a global biomass map, and from global biomass, combining this with field data sets, we could also get at carbon stocks. Now, of course, this is at a global scale, and so you will always have some uncertainty and errors in this, but it's a really helpful baseline data set to have to know if you're trying to make any decisions or trying to plan your any types of projects. This is a really nice baseline data set to have of canopy height, biomass, and carbon stocks. And so, as I mentioned, we're now working on the updated version of this, which would be for 2015. And the data for the 2020 timeframe has also been made available now. So hoping to be working on the third version or the third update of this data set. The other thing that I think I will mention here is that since the first original canopy height maps have been produced, there have been now many different canopy height map products for global forests. Some do work very well in mangroves and some do not. So I think that is sometimes a bit of a confusion and something that I'm happy to talk about later if you would like to have any more insight into which maps to use for mangrove canopy height or biomass or carbon stocks. Second data set that I will mention, which is complementary to the Global Mangrove Watch and the analysis that Pete just mentioned, is a data set on global drivers of mangrove loss that we've produced from 2000 to 2016. Here we combined essentially the baseline data from GMW that's looking at change and combined it with many other data sets on population on and satellite data set to get at what the main drivers were of loss in mangroves during this time frame. So here it essentially allows us to separate the different losses into 5 categories, which again is a helpful data set to have if you're trying to inform your decisions or trying to plan, let's say, a restoration project or some type of conservation. And then finally, I wanted to show an application of how these data sets were combined together and could be used to make any types of predictions. So here's an example from a paper on future carbon emissions from global mangrove forest loss, where essentially data on emission factors, the carbon stocks, and the drivers of the loss have been combined in order to produce a model of what predicted carbon losses were in mangroves. Now, I also would like to show that a lot of these data sets are actually online in web apps where you can visualize the data. All of the data is also available for download from different sources. All of our NASA data, when we were producing maps, is shared on our data archives. But we also have been working on producing apps so that it could be easy for visualization. So here I have a link. I'm happy to share it some more, but it's quite simple, mangrovescience.earthengine.app. If you go to this link, you will see that there's a suite of apps, of web apps, of mapping apps that essentially highlight different applications that can be useful, especially for people who might not be experts in the remote sensing space. And finally, I wanted to show some other examples. I think one that is quite useful also for people who are trying to produce their own maps is to use this app that uses a random forest algorithm. So essentially, it's a classification algorithm for mapping tailored specifically to map mangroves. And I think with that, I will end the show to make sure that I'm on time.
Thanks, Lola.
So those global products that Pete and Lola have been talking about, they're really important. But as Pete was saying, sometimes they're not able to get the local nuance, the local characteristics. And so I have the luxury of working in an area where I could spend a lot of time and try to understand that. And we're going to talk about, taking it down a notch and trying to get better in terms of spatial extent, and then also looking at volume, canopy volume. And I want to first start off by just, this essential question of what can you resolve at what resolution? And the rule of thumb is typically, if you want to map a fringing mangrove that is 5 meters, your spatial resolution needs to be at least 2.5 meters or half of that. So, and that's the minimum. And so we, at this scale, we use a lot of sub 5 meter imagery. Dove products is what we've been using. And we use a lot of drones to collect a lot of that data. And I'm calling in from the Bahamas office for the Nature Conservancy, and we're spending a lot of time going out in the field and trying to understand. Elevation makes such a difference, and you can see in this drone image that this there's an elevated area here where you've got a broadleaf coppice ring, and so we're trying to find that boundary. Coppice is a broadleaf forest. And so we're trying to find that boundary. And in areas like Andros Island, when we look at the dove imagery, we can separate that line out. When we overlay some of the global products that we've been using in the past, there's a lot of the scrub mangroves which you can't expect it to detect. And so this finer resolution imagery, we can segment that out and then classify that and derive different vegetation indices to come up with quantity. And then we can bring in elevation to try to separate out where we're most likely not going to see mangrove. But really, we want to get at a product where we're going down to that finer resolution and trying to separate out that distinction between the broadleaf and the mangrove. And elevation is really the driving factor there. And one other thing is also tracking the recovery of mangroves. For example, Hurricane Dorian did incredible damage to the mangroves in Grand Bahama and Abaco. And we're using a tool called Blue Carbon, which is another bluecarbon.tnc.org, the Blue Carbon Explorer, which allows you to access the archive of satellite imagery, bring in the extent that we've mapped for mangroves, and then run analyses to see where mangroves are recovering and where there may be a need for intervention to restore those areas. And we've been using that tool to identify 10,000 hectare of areas that we want to have main intervention that local partners are now reforesting. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Steve. Short and sweet. So you sort of hit on one of the questions that came in by email there, which was about mapping of fringe mangroves are less than 20 meters. So did you have any more comments on that? Sounds like you need a resolution of at least 10 meters or to use drones.
Yeah, fringing mangroves, I work a lot in small islands, and fringing mangroves are, they can be extremely narrow, especially in islands where you've got steep slopes. And so that definitely will require something like SkySat to map those. We've used that a lot, and it's been successful. We recently did some updates of some national parks, and SkySat was able to see those fringing mangroves. But once you start, and that's got a 0.5 meter resolution, but we had a hard time picking up some of the really narrow mangroves with the dove imagery at 0.4 meter.
Right. Lola,
I'm sorry, 4 meter, not 0.4.
Yeah, 4 meters, yeah. Lola, did you have any comments on the fringing mangroves and how they are picked up or not in the global products?
Yeah, I think, fringing mangroves, any small patches are quite difficult to find in the global products, as are small losses or gains. And so that's where it's really important to do exactly what Steve has been doing, is using kind of the higher resolution data, or you know, doing a more targeted, maybe reanalysis of even with the existing data sets for your specific site.
Great, thank you. Question for Pete from on the Q&A there. How have the deforestation alerts been connected with conservation groups on the ground to allow more rapid responses? What have been the challenges? And any lessons you've learned on how alerts can be integrated into mangrove protection or actions such as supporting legal enforcement teams?
Okay, there's a lot in there. I guess in the first instance, they're publicly available via the Global Mangrove Watch portal, which is the kind of main way in which people get access to them. We've been doing some things, and this kind of falls into maybe the kind of wider kind of Global Mangrove Watch stroke GMA teams of people, kind of particularly thinking of people at Wetlands International and TNC, where I know we've been working a bit with the government in Thailand, where they've been being sent kind of some of the alert files separately to, in addition to what's on the portal, and they've been having people go out and actually check the alerts and give us feedback, which has been quite useful. I think there may be something good that's going to be starting shortly in Kenya that may be doing something similar, where people will actually be going out and checking alerts. And I think something is happening in Ecuador, but I don't have any examples of any kind of particular success stories. I think the example I tend to go to is the one I showed in Kenya, sorry, not Kenya, Guinea-Bissau, is a good one where Wetlands International were able to go out. But unfortunately, in that case, it was actually a government-sponsored project for food security for 2 local villages. So I think there was good conversations between Wetlands International and the staff and the government, and they were interested to see what the alerts will keep providing. But in that particular instance, kind of food security was the driver, and that's understandable.
Thanks. Yeah, so it sounds like we'll need to look for some more examples, and hopefully people can let you know if they're using the alerts, but having that integration is really key for you too, and improving the accuracy of them as well, because you're getting the feedback. Yeah.
I mean, feedback, which I'm sure Lola and Steve would agree with as well, is crucial, because I mean, like, we're particularly if we're looking at these kind of global products, we cannot know everywhere in the world, and you know, we're largely relying on looking at things like the Planet Dove data, or looking at interpreting the satellite imagery ourselves. And there's a big difference between that and someone having boots on the ground and having local knowledge of the area. So feedback is brilliant.
Right, thank you. Steve, did you have any comments, you know, working for the Nature Conservancy, about how you might use alerts or how you use that data for mangrove protection and conservation?
We really rely on local eyes and ears to really give us information. And, you know, going back to global versus, you know, local type data, when you go down to that less than 5 meter resolution, it becomes more expensive. You know, the publicly available data sets aren't available. And so that does require an investment, but there are, you know, Planet offers a global forest monitoring program paid by the Norwegians, the NICFI program that allows people to access their data free of charge. And so there's opportunities out there to try to get at that scale. But in terms of alerts, we don't do any real-time monitoring at that scale. We largely rely on locals who let our individual offices know there's something going on.
Right,
that's
thanks.
why it's real important to have an active community citizen science group that can help inform you.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you could just share that Planet link that you mentioned in the chat as well. That would be helpful. So yeah, question from Dina also for Steve, maybe Lola as well. Couple of questions here. First one, are there plans to include drivers of change in the loss alerts? So maybe Lola and Pete want to answer that, and then question for Steve.
Maybe I can start. In terms of the alerts, it's not planned as a regular product. I think we we did in the publication that kind of went along with the alerts, which was just focused on Africa. We did visually kind of do a check using the planet data of what drivers were, but no, it's not something we're planning to automate and have something as a regular thing. I think that would be probably quite a hard problem to achieve as well. But maybe Lola's got ideas of how it may be done. But yeah.
Thanks, Lola. Did you want to comment on how the driver's data is produced, and could it be
Sure.
done real time
Oh, real time?
or near real time?
I think it could be done. I don't know that it could be done well. And I think it's a great idea to like move towards that. But we're not there yet.
Cool. I guess it's quite complicated. I mean, could you elaborate a bit on what's the complicating step? Like, is it
Sure.
the algorithms or getting the
So-
sufficient data?
I think first of all, there's a little bit of a delay in the way that between if you had an alert and finding the driver, because the way that we identify the drivers is by mapping what the mangrove area essentially changed to. So was it converted to an aquaculture pond or agriculture, or is it due to erosion? You know, is it basically, did it change to water? So we have kind of a two-step process or three-step where first it's loss, then we did like a decision tree to separate it into, you know, soil dry loss, like it gets confirmed to open soil, converted to like an open soil or to water, and then using other ancillary data sets like other satellite data, existing maps, high resolution data. We then did a classification to find out what the conversion was, like what it converted to. And so there's kind of a delay between the loss and then what it gets converted to, if it does.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, big complicated task to try and do the alerts. Yeah.
I think coming in there, I mean, one of the, I guess, ideas with the alerts is trying to have that kind of local relevance. And sometimes on that local relevance, like it's quite a detailed question about what's the driver, because it may be that it's a deforestation event or someone's been and cut mangroves. But I guess the question then is, why have they cut the mangroves? And that we can't tell normally we can't tell from a satellite image. So whether it's for food security or whether it's for fuel or what's the purpose behind it. And I guess that's where like the satellite imagery can't really give you that kind of information as well.
Great, thank you. Another question for Steve. How are you measuring growth? And if you are there also field models for the satellite data, or do you use NDVI?
We are mainly using NDVI to look at changes, and that's what that Blue Carbon Explorer tool uses. So it's been very helpful in trying to detect where mangroves that have been wiped out with natural disasters. The primary drivers of mangrove deforestation where I work in the Caribbean are natural disasters, and then we've got alteration of the hydrology, and then coastal development. Those are the top three. So we can use Google Earth. We have partners that use that and try to track changes over time to look at patterns. You know, we're really focused on getting national scale products and relying a lot on our local partners to provide us input on getting those refined, and then just doing capacity building exercises to get so they can be able to collect the data with drones and use readily accessible satellite imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So,
thank you. Lola, I was just wondering, with the Halt products that NASA has been creating, can you do growth with those now that you're getting a time series?
So I think that if we're using the same data set over multiple time periods, we could do growth. So once we have this 2015 and then the 2020 data actually available, then those two, I would feel comfortable using them to calculate growth. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, that'd be exciting to see that.
Yeah, another way to do it would be, if you have airborne acquisitions, LiDAR data, for example, or any other types, but those would be much smaller scale.
Mm.
Oh,
Right.
one thing I wanted to add is in our restoration plots, we are monitoring the growth of the propagules using drones, and that's been really, really helpful in assessing the survivorship of the propagules that are planted. And we're actually using deep learning techniques to detect those mangroves, and it picks up quite well against the mud flats, the background of the imagery.
So that's like growth in the area from the top, or using LiDAR, or yeah.
Oh, it's all just photogrammetry. So no LiDAR.
Yeah, right. It's amazing. Heather Stewart has a question. Maybe Heather, if you don't mind putting your microphone on to elaborate a bit more. She asked how multiple stresses handled with these models.
Yeah, and just to clarify, here a lot of our mangroves have multiple stressors impacting them at the same time. So sometimes when we see a mortality event, it's due to a long-term stressor and then acute stressor on top of that. So I was just wondering, with some of these models where you're using the change in
what stressor would it be attributed to?
Yeah, how do you account which one it is caused by?
Yeah, right, maybe that one to Lola, and then we can answer your question about composition. You happy to answer that, Lola?
Yeah, when you have multiple stressors, it's really difficult to work on that. I think that's where you would kind of figure out the main stressor. We did do an analysis of loss in Florida, in the Florida Everglades, where I think there were multiple stressors. There was, a Hurricane Irma came through, so it seems like it's a hurricane, but really it's also the history of water diversion and the mangroves actually being really stressed from drought from a 2016 El Nino. So I think this is where you then do the deep dives into the site-specific kind of analysis. It's very difficult to do on a global scale.
Yeah, it sounds like the answers need to do site-specific analysis. And I'm going to guess this is one for Pete, but maybe any panelist. Can you look at shifts in species composition? We're always looking at, particularly with the global maps, we're looking at maps of mangrove area, but yeah, there's lots of different mangrove species. So, Pete?
Yeah, interesting one. There are studies that have tried to look at kind of mapping species. I know there's the main place I've seen it maybe is Northern Australia, where you do see kind of there's a clear kind of spectral differences between the kind of species zonations. The real challenge with that is training data for any models. I think if we, and probably those models, I would guess, are probably locally relevant rather than kind of globally applicable, would be my guess. So if we had lots of training data of what different species or mangroves were globally, we could probably give it a go and probably come up with a reasonable result. But that training data just doesn't exist. So, and I don't really know how we would. Well, it would be a lot of work to go and kind of collect it and to find people who know what those species are. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge there. And I guess when I'm talking about species from this kind of broad remote sensing point of view, I'm talking kind of like is it a rhizophora or an Abyssinia, not kind of sub things below that as well, so there's probably a kind of a definition of what we refer to as species that needs to be kind of captured in that as well. So I think it is probably one of those things where, yeah, if the training data exists, like people like Lola, Steve, and myself could give it a go, and like I think in quite a few areas it would probably be okay. But yeah, training data.
Heather has a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to that point, and thank you, Pete, so much. I guess not necessarily individual species, but more of a change in the complexity of forest. So whether a forest is becoming more of a monoculture, whether it's through replanting or restoration efforts where maybe there's less of a seed source, and then also if an area is impacted by multiple stressors, whether that's causing a shift in that composition.
Yeah, okay. So the answer probably is locally yes, kind of globally no, it would be my guess, because if you think of kind of your variation in the signal, whether it's reflectance in an optical system or backscatter from radar, you get kind of quite a lot of things that cause that variation, whether it's kind of a degrading kind of, if it's optical data, atmospheric effects that cause that signal to kind of naturally fluctuate a bit that we measure. And probably there's a species signal in there as well, in terms of kind of over time, there's some species shift, but kind of knowing what that is and be able to kind of reliably kind of pull that out from everything else. I think if you've got good local knowledge of the area and you know that that effect is happening, or you strongly suspect that effect is happening, and you kind of have a broad idea of what kind of pattern you would expect to see, you could probably see it in the imagery, and therefore you could probably kind of classify it and pull it out. But I think a bit with like all the conversation about drivers, kind of like when you start getting in that detail of lots of different things happening, trying to come up with some generic system that can do it everywhere is really very hard.
Great, thank you. I'll and if anyone has any examples of mapping species composition locally, feel free to share it on the chat, and I'll send some show notes afterwards, and I'll try and look up a couple of the local studies on this topic. So while you're there, Pete, maybe you can start this next question that Tom Worthington sent to me, a difficult one. What's the definition of mangroves, and does it vary across the world? For example, tropical versus temperate regions.
Yeah, okay. That's a discussion we've been having with within our kind of Global Mangrove Watch work around version 4. I think with version 3 and the older versions, we were just kind of focused on trying to get everything working. And I think the maps have now started improving, where this question of what's the definition of a mangrove, like, so how many mangroves do you need in a pixel for that pixel to be specified as a mangrove? What height or cover do you need in those kind of attributes for it to be mangroves? And I don't really know what that answer is. You can see examples of where publications have used different definitions, and I guess there's also there's a fact of scale associated with that as well. So I guess in the kind of the Global Mangrove Watch extent maps, largely it's down to what we kind of interpret from the imagery that we can see that looks like it's probably mangroves, but without having a whole bunch of kind of field data kind of going along with that on the ground for a number of different areas, it's kind of difficult for me to tell you kind of what exactly our definition of mangroves is, and that probably does vary a bit from different areas. So yeah, it's a difficult one, and I think it's probably one that's worth a discussion as kind of a wider GMA science group discussion, maybe, in terms of kind of what we should be mapping, because as mangroves.
I'll maybe just comment on like past maps. The area of mangroves has changed a lot, right, across different mapping products, and the Global Mangrove Watch added a lot of mangroves compared to earlier maps, right?
It did, but some of that is down to mapping error. So like you will see when I mean, some people have already had a look at on the call, have already seen some of the version 4 maps. I mean, when you compare there, we've probably, say, I wouldn't be surprised, removed about 10% of the map of the area we've mapped as mangroves, but added about 20%. And most of that is just down to mapping error. We were mapping things that weren't mangroves, and we've missed a bunch of stuff that was mangroves. So there's some of that is just improvement in the methodology and improvement in our knowledge of and from user feedback over what's mangrove. So I think that's probably the bigger difference there in terms of the mapping efforts, is that kind of refining down kind of what really is mangroves, rather than it being changes in definition. But definition is probably another more difficult topic, I think.
Great, thanks. I saw Lola had put a mic off there. Did you have a response to that one too, Lola?
No, I think what Pete said sounds about right.
Yeah, just an experience from the Bahamas is that there is an extensive amount of very short scrub and dwarf mangrove, and that is very difficult to pick up. And just for an example, the 2020 version had 1,500 square kilometers of mangrove that was mapped, but when we did the fine scale analysis and really tried hard using that local knowledge and the field data to get those really sparse scrub mangroves, the area went up over 200%. And we knew that was the case, but we tested it. So it's very, geographic specific. And so that's the difficult part.
I wonder if you could comment more on the policy making side. Maybe one of you can comment for like a local group, and one of you can comment for like a national mangrove mapping exercise. How would you consider these areas, and if there's a 200% change, like what does that mean for policymakers who are trying to interpret, blue carbon at the national scale, or look at, which mangroves are protected at the local scale?
Well, I just think we really need to educate what are the limitations and what we're doing. Our imagery is getting better. We're getting better spatial, spectral, and temporal resolution, and our ability to map is increasing. Our ability to collect field data, these are all things that impact how our ability to map, and so we have to let policy decision makers try to understand, that sometimes when you increase the resolution, your area gets less. Sometimes when you increase the resolution, you get more. It depends on the area. So, communicating that limitation is important in this process, and make sure they understand what the products represent. And we need to, state the accuracy, and that requires, field work, which is expensive.
Thanks. Peter, Lola, do you have any comments for policymakers or decision makers at a local scale when they're using these products, how they deal with errors or differences in definition?
Yeah, I think this is where you really have to focus on the local scale and see what your local definition is. I think, generally speaking, when we're talking about mangroves, we do always use the same type of species of mangroves. And, sometimes the question is, what's the difference between a mangrove ecosystem and the actual mangrove tree? So especially when we're using the map product, sometimes they might not use the same definition. So I think I would just look at, how exactly what is the map working on? Are they working just on mangrove forests or the trees, or does it also include, the entire ecosystem, and so the soil, etc.?
Right, thanks.
Maybe another way of thinking about it, particularly when you're looking at some of the global products, is that, a processing chain that we do in the Global Mangrove Watch is that we correct kind of the areas using the accuracy assessment. So if the accuracy assessment says we've missed 10%, it's not as high as that. I think it's only about 4% these days. But if it says we can basically, we don't know where those mangroves are, but we can add 4%. If it says that we've overclassified, we can remove a bit from the areas, and we do that at a global scale. So we do a global accuracy assessment across a random stratified set of sites. But if you were to do that, if you have an area that you're already interested in, but you don't have the ability, the knowledge or ability to kind of take up satellite imagery and do your own maps, one thing you could do is say, take the area you're interested in, take one of the global products, and then kind of do your accuracy assessment from that, and then basically adjust the areas according. So if the global product for your area of interest is missing, say like in Steve's case, 100% of the 200% of the mangroves or whatever, then if you're underestimating that, then you could then basically correct that area by basically taking that map and using it as a baseline to correct using your accuracy assessment data. So that is one thing you could do to kind of help improve estimates.
Right, thank you. Tom, did you have a comment on this as well?
Yeah, I just wonder how it fits in with the kind of ideas of looking at multiple ecosystems, so sort of skiscape conservation and restoration, where, you know, in certain areas you've got kind of mangroves and salt marshes kind of merging together, and at, you know, what point do we say it's a mangrove or a salt marsh, or do we not? Does that actually not matter? And when we're thinking about conservation and restoration, we should be thinking about kind of that joined up mosaic of ecosystems. I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Thanks. Is that a question or?
Yeah, I just wondered if when we think about mapping, do we want to be thinking about like mapping multiple kind of ecosystems within
Yeah. All right. Yeah, we'll hand that to the panel. And there was a question that came online as well about the salt marsh in particular. So
I think maybe I'll start. I think it's a really good point, and and it comes down to that partly comes down to that question of what your definition of mangroves is versus your definition of salt marsh. I guess there's also, if we're thinking about products going forward, something it probably won't end up in the version 4 maps, but something we're starting to have a look at is whether we can, rather than just having a mangrove extent map that says if this is mangroves or it's not mangroves, is that we could produce some sort of probability layer that kind of goes along with it, or some sort of certainty layer, in which case people could cut their layer slightly differently depending on whether they'd like to have more or less. And maybe if we did that for all ecosystems, then you could have, in terms of mapping, whether you could take a salt marsh layer or you take a mangrove layer, maybe that would provide some more information in terms of doing that merging. But it is a really difficult thing, particularly when you're putting a hard boundary in, and hard boundaries, as much as they work nicely in our GIS and they kind of mean that you can easily calculate an area, they don't exist in the real world, and that's kind of the crux of the problem, I guess.
Yeah, often the mangroves and salt marsh are merging together, aren't they? So it's not super clear delineation. Yeah. That's another question probably for you, Pete, was about looking at degradation maps in the GMW, the Global Mangrove Watch.
Good question. It's not something that we've been looking at. It's something that's on the list that we would like to look at, but yeah, it's not currently. Well, we currently don't have the kind of time or resource to kind of look at that in detail. I mean, I don't know whether, I think maybe Lola, and maybe to not wanting to drag Tom into this, but maybe I know Tom's looked at this stuff in the past as well, so maybe I can hand over to those guys.
Thanks. Come on, Lola, have any comments? And then Lola, there's another question for you about the drivers as well.
So the question is about degradation mapping.
Yeah.
That's a really tough, it's a tough one on a global scale, I think. It's of course one that's really interested in needed. That's where you really have to look kind of more at the time series. We are working on it for specific geographies. So we have been working on degradation in the Caribbean and using different approaches. We're still trying to figure out which one is the best one, so that it could be kind of rolled out into a product. But I think, you know, when you're looking at degradation, there's so many different forms of it, and so many different definitions that it's often easier to tailor it again at a local scale, unless you're looking only at maybe a change in canopy cover, you know, over time, and using that as a indicator of degradation.
Yes, yeah, I guess part of the challenge is what's the ecological definition of degradation, and there's many ways of defining it. Yeah. So there's a question about the classification test for the drivers. I'm very interested to understand in general about the integration model and what parameters are used. and what have been the challenges? So maybe just a bit more details on that decision tree and what are the challenges with computing the large data sets, integrating these large data sets.
Sure, and I'm just looking, I had open here the page where we were, the code is actually available online. We've made it available in an app, and I'm just going to pull it up right now. So that 1 second.
Yeah, so I guess for background, as I understand the driver's data is looking at other data sets like distance to roads and so forth to help with the classification of what's the cause of the mangrove loss.
Yeah, so if you go to this app, mangrovelossdrivers.app, you can find the paper, the app, or you can look at the data yourself in Earth Engine. So if we click here, here's the methodology. It gives you a little bit more detail. But you can also explore the data online. So essentially what we used is, looking at time series analysis. Everything was done in Google Earth Engine. Yes, we have there's a combination of different levels of codes that you can use to replicate this. We're also, again, we're working on an updated version of this one. But I think the methodology is relatively straightforward. And since then, there have been many other new models. We used some machine learning in here, but I think that if people are really well versed in machine learning, they can try to test out some newer other applications of different machine learning models. But again, it all comes down to kind of not necessarily just the field data here, but knowledge of what's happening on the ground. And so
with the app, you can retrain the models for your local area with this app.
So with the app, this is the actual app where you can visualize the data that we produced. But if you look at the paper, then the code for the actual model should be in the paper, I believe.
Oh, okay. Not, yeah, I can share the link later.
We can make it available. Yeah,
yep.
we different versions of it, and happy to share.
Yeah. So that means someone with the technical expertise could rerun it if they had a particular interest or want to change some of the assumptions or parameters.
Yes, and I encourage that actually. I think it would be really useful to have this, especially on, if you're working in a very specific region, because then you could retrain it and probably get much better results.
That's great. It's amazing. And then I guess
your application.
Yeah. Following on from that, there's a question about including climate change drivers like increasing frequency and intensity of hurricanes or impacts of sea level rise.
Yeah, I think that's, the real obvious next step to go. And again, that's where sometimes it depends on data availability. If you have hurricane predictions, or you have a prediction of an increase of hurricanes and the geographic location and sea level rise, then you could definitely add those into there as your predictors.
Okay, thank you. And maybe just 2 minutes for one final question. Do you have good examples of places to access relevant in situ data, either for validation or for understanding drivers of change? And what do you define as, how do you define these as good? So maybe Lola and the other two want to comment on that final one.
I would say that we've primarily been using, high resolution data that we might find. Some you find in Google Earth, some are from individual field campaigns where you take geotagged photos. I think for a repository of in situ data, I would say primarily we've been using Google Earth and Collect Earth online. I don't really know of any other repository with data sets that could be used.
Right, thank you. Does anyone else have answers there.
Yeah, I don't know of any repository, but I just wanted to quickly comment, like, that question of what is the definition of mangrove? And I think it's based on the question, you know, if you're blue carbon accounting, that's one definition. If you're doing conservation planning, that's another definition. So, I don't think we need to force, you know, one definition. It's based on the question, and that also we need to be managing for coastal systems, so not just a single habitat. And that's what we've tried to do, you know, looking at coral, mangrove, seagrass, since they're all working together. That's another clear message that I've been hearing. I just wanted to make those 2 points.
Yeah, especially in conservation planning or blue carbon, it's not so just the mangroves, and like, you know, carbon in salt marsh and seagrass and so forth. Yeah. Thanks. Pete, did you have anything to follow up on about the definition or the repositories of data, in situ data?
No, not really. I think we're in a probably similar situation to Lola, so I'd largely agree with what she said. Largely, yeah, I don't know of any repositories of good mangrove data, field data, but yeah, high resolution imagery, and kind of try to use that to interpret what we can see. Other things is, well, we've sent the version 4 product, we sent it out to various people asking for feedback. Largely that came through in terms of kind of people sending screenshots back, or kind of digitizing some polygons and saying this is an area where it was right or it was wrong, and things like that. So it was kind of asking a specific question to what we were trying to achieve, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, so it sounds like if you're working in a local area, then it's worthwhile building up your own repository of data sources you can get either from people that know, or photos, or other local data sources, and you could retrain some of these models to make them better for your region. So we've hit the hour mark, so I'd just like to thank very much our 3 panelists today for joining in, and thank you all for your comments and questions, and hopefully see you at the next webinar. So the next one will be happening in a few weeks. I'll get the invite out soon, and it will be about managing pollution in mangroves. So thanks so much again for joining today.